I never imagined that my daughter-in-law's wedding day would turn into one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. Weddings are supposed to be filled with joy, laughter, and blessings, but instead I was forced into a situation that tested not only my patience, but also my dignity. Let me take you back to that day. The church was beautifully decorated with flowers and candles. Guests were arriving in elegant clothes, the music was soft, and everything seemed perfect. I stood proudly, thinking about how my son was starting a new life with the woman he loved. As a father, that was all I ever wanted, to see my children happy and well settled. But then something happened that I will never forget. During the reception, while everyone was eating and drinking, my new daughter-in-law came up to me. She had a confident, almost arrogant look on her face. She didn't start with any kind words or respect. Instead, she leaned close to me and said in front of several people, "You should give us your house. A young family needs it more than an old man living alone." Her words hit me like a knife in the chest. My house wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was the place where I raised my children, where my late wife and I built memories, where every corner told a story. And now this young woman who had just married into my family demanded it as if I owed it to her. I looked her straight in the eyes and calmly said, "No, that house is not just a building. It is my home, and I will not give it away." But instead of backing off, she did something unthinkable. In front of my relatives, my friends, and my son, she raised her hand and slapped me across the face. The room went silent. Everyone froze in shock. I felt the sting on my cheek, but more than the physical pain, it was the humiliation that burned inside me. My son didn't even know what to say. He stood there, torn between his new wife and his father. Some guests whispered, others gasped, but no one dared to intervene. For a moment, I felt completely alone. But I am not the kind of man who allows disrespect to crush him. I took a deep breath, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my phone. Without a word, I dialed a number I knew very well, a number I hadn't called in years, but one I trusted. As I pressed the call button, everyone around me watched in confusion. My daughter-in-law smirked, thinking I was helpless. But 20 minutes later, when two men in suits walked through the door, her face changed. That smirk disappeared, replaced with fear. And that was the moment the tables began to turn. The room grew tense the moment those two men entered. They weren't ordinary guests, anyone could tell just by looking at them. They wore dark suits, polished shoes, and carried an air of authority. They didn't need to raise their voices or make a scene. Their very presence was enough to demand attention. My daughter-in-law's face turned pale. She tried to keep her composure, but I saw her hands tremble slightly. The guests whispered to one another, wondering who these men were and why they had arrived so suddenly. My son looked at me with confusion in his eyes, silently asking, "Dad, what's going on?" I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the men. They greeted me respectfully with a nod. One of them leaned closer and said quietly, "We came as fast as we could, sir. What do you need us to do?" At that moment, I didn't want revenge. I wasn't going to lower myself to my daughter-in-law's level. But I wanted her and everyone else in that room to understand something very important. Respect must be earned, not demanded. I turned back to the crowd. My cheek still burned from the slap, but my voice was steady as I spoke. All my life, I've worked hard for what I have. I built my home brick by brick with my wife, who is no longer with us. Every corner of that house carries memories, memories no one has the right to steal from me. And today,
On what should have been a day of joy, I was humiliated in front of my family. The room stayed silent. Even the music had stopped. Everyone was listening. My daughter-in-law shifted uncomfortably, trying to appear strong, but her eyes betrayed her fear. I continued. These men you see here, they are not here to harm anyone. They are here because I wanted to remind myself and all of you that I am not a man to be disrespected. I don't need to fight. I don't need to shout. I simply act. The two suited men stepped closer, their presence like a shadow over my daughter-in-law. She tried to laugh nervously and said, "It was just a joke. I didn't mean it." But her voice cracked, and everyone could see through her lie. I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "A wife should support her husband. A daughter-in-law should respect the family she marries into. Instead, you thought you could take what was never yours. You thought you could humiliate me and walk away. But now everyone sees who you really are." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to reach for my son's hand, but even he hesitated. My son looked torn, ashamed, and unsure of what to do. One of the suited men pulled out an envelope and handed it to me. I opened it and revealed a document, proof of ownership of my house, signed and sealed by the court, showing without a doubt that I was the sole owner. I raised it high for everyone to see. This house is mine, and it will remain mine until the day I decide otherwise. And let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can take advantage of my kindness. The guests began to murmur, some nodding in agreement. A few even clapped quietly, breaking the heavy silence in the hall. My daughter-in-law's face turned red with embarrassment. She couldn't hold back her tears anymore. She broke down crying right there in front of everyone. The strong, arrogant mask she had worn all day shattered into pieces. And at that moment, I knew she would never dare to disrespect me again. But the story didn't end there. The real challenge began after the wedding, when the consequences of that day followed us home.
The wedding ended, but the tension didn't. Guests left whispering about what they had witnessed, and my son drove off with his new bride in awkward silence. I went home that night, exhausted but firm in my heart. I had stood my ground, and everyone saw it. Yet I also knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. 2 days later, my son came to visit me alone. He looked troubled. His usual cheerful smile was gone, replaced with guilt. He sat down heavily on the couch and said, "Dad, I'm sorry for what happened. She shouldn't have slapped you. It was wrong. But you know how she is. She gets emotional. She didn't mean it." I raised an eyebrow. Didn't mean it? She humiliated me in front of our entire family. She demanded my house as if I were some burden to get rid of. And then she laid her hand on me. Is that what you call emotional? He lowered his head. He knew I was right. But love makes people blind, and my son was already trapped between his loyalty to his wife and his respect for me. That evening, when he left, I stood at the window and watched him drive away. I could see it in his face. This was not the last conversation we would have about the house. And I was right. Within a week, my daughter-in-law showed up at my doorstep. She didn't come alone. She brought her mother. The moment I opened the door, her mother started speaking in a sharp tone. "Why are you holding on to such a big house all by yourself? Don't you think it's selfish? A young couple could build their life here while you live in something smaller. Isn't it time you stepped aside?" I couldn't believe the audacity.
It wasn't enough that my daughter-in-law had tried to take my home. Now her mother was trying to pressure me as well. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I calmly invited them inside, poured them tea, and let them talk. They rambled on about responsibility, sacrifice, and thinking of the future. Finally, when they were done, I set my cup down and said, "Do you know how many nights I worked double shifts to build that house? Do you know how many sacrifices my wife and I made so that our children would have a roof over their heads? That home isn't just walls. It is my blood, sweat, and tears. And if you think I will hand it over because of guilt or pressure, you are mistaken." My daughter-in-law glared at me, her pride wounded again. She muttered under her breath, "You'll regret this." Her mother gasped, embarrassed by her daughter's words, but said nothing. They left in anger, slamming the door behind them. That night, I sat alone in my living room. The silence of the house surrounded me. And for the first time in years, I wondered if my wife, God rest her soul, would have handled it differently. Maybe she would have tried to keep the peace. But I knew one thing for sure. She would never allow anyone to disrespect our family's legacy. Days passed, and the situation grew colder. My son stopped calling as often. When he did visit, his wife stayed in the car, refusing to come inside. The once warm relationship between father and son was now strained by greed and pride. But deep down, I had a feeling. Something told me that this fight for the house was not over. That slap at the wedding was just the first spark of a fire that was about to spread further than I had imagined. And I was right, because one evening I received a letter in the mail, a legal notice. My daughter-in-law had convinced my son to file a petition in court demanding that I transfer the ownership of my house to them. It was no longer just family conflict. It was war.
The day I held that legal notice in my hand, I felt a chill run through my body. I had faced many challenges in life: poverty, loss, loneliness, but nothing cut as deeply as this betrayal. My own son, the boy I had raised with love and care, had allowed greed and manipulation to poison his heart. The notice stated that they were seeking fair distribution of family property. Fair distribution? I almost laughed. The house had been built long before my son even dreamed of marriage. It was mine, legally and morally. But still, the fact that they had dragged me to court felt like a knife through my back. I knew I had to prepare. The very next morning, I contacted my lawyer, an old friend who had stood by me through many storms in life. When I showed him the documents, he shook his head. "They don't have a case. You're the sole owner. This is intimidation, nothing more. But you must be ready. This won't just be about law. This is about family. And sometimes family fights can be crueler than enemies." He was right. The first court hearing was packed. My son and daughter-in-law sat on the opposite side, avoiding my gaze. She looked confident, dressed sharply, whispering into his ear as if she were guiding the battle. He, on the other hand, looked uncomfortable, nervous even. It pained me to see him like that, but I also know he had chosen his path. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The case was presented. Their lawyer painted a picture of me as an old man who no longer needed such a large house, implying I was selfish for keeping it. He even suggested I was mentally unfit to manage property, which made the blood in my veins boil. When it was my turn, my lawyer stood with quiet strength. He presented the ownership papers, tax receipts, and photographs from decades ago, showing me and my late wife building that home brick by brick. He spoke with passion. "This house is not just property. It is a man's life's work.
No law, no tradition, no argument can strip him of what he rightfully owns. The judge nodded thoughtfully, but I knew the process would not be quick. Courts are slow, and in the meantime, my family was breaking apart. After the session, as I was leaving, my son caught up to me in the hallway. His voice was low, almost pleading. "Dad, please, can't you just give her the house? It will make everything easier." I stopped in my tracks. I turned to him, my eyes heavy with disappointment. "Easier for who? For her? For you? Tell me, son, was it easy when I worked double shift so you could study? Was it easy when your mother and I skipped meals so you could eat? Was it easy when I stayed awake all night by your bedside when you were sick? No, life wasn't easy, but I never gave up on you, and now you're asking me to give up my home?" His eyes welled up with tears, but before he could say another word, his wife appeared, grabbed his arm, and pulled him away. She didn't want him to listen. She wanted him under her control. That night, I sat in my empty house. For the first time in years, it felt cold. The laughter that once filled those rooms was gone. I walked through the halls, touching the walls, remembering the sound of my children running, the smell of my wife's cooking, the warmth of our family gatherings. And I made a promise to myself. I would not let anyone steal those memories, not through greed, not through lies, not even through the betrayal of my own son. This was no longer just about a house. This was about dignity, about respect, about standing up for everything my life had meant. And as I closed my eyes that night, I realized the battle had only just begun.
The second hearing came sooner than I expected. I arrived at the courthouse early, carrying only a small folder of documents and a heavy heart. The hallway was filled with lawyers, families, and clerks rushing from one room to another. But in the middle of all that noise, I felt strangely calm. My son and daughter-in-law arrived moments later. She walked with her head high, almost like she had already won. My son, however, avoided looking at me. He carried himself like a man burdened by invisible chains. When the session began, their lawyer tried a new tactic. He presented a statement claiming that I had verbally promised the house to my son years ago. According to them, I had told my son, "One day this house will be yours." I clenched my fists under the table. Of course I had said something like that. Every father dreams of leaving something behind for his children. But a father's dream is not a legal contract. I had never signed anything, never given away my rights. It was a manipulation of my words, twisted into a weapon against me. My lawyer stood firmly and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, there is no written evidence, no legal document, not even a witness to this so-called promise. A casual remark of hope cannot be used as proof of ownership transfer." The judge nodded, but didn't say much. The case was becoming more emotional than legal, and that worried me. After the hearing, I decided to dig deeper. That night, I opened an old wooden box where I had kept my wife's letters, photographs, and important papers. As I sorted through them, I found something unexpected. A letter from my wife, written shortly before she passed away. In it, she had expressed her wish that the house should always remain in my name until my final day. She had feared exactly this kind of conflict, and she wanted me to stay protected. Holding that letter in my hands, I felt her presence again. Tears filled my eyes, but they were not tears of weakness. They were a reminder that I was not fighting alone. The next hearing, I brought the letter. When my lawyer presented it, the courtroom fell silent. The handwriting was clearly my wife's, and the date showed it was written years ago. Even the judge took a moment to read it carefully. My daughter-in-law's face twisted in frustration. She hadn't expected this. She leaned over to whisper furiously into my son's ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the anger in her eyes. And then something happened that no one expected. One of my distant relatives, who had been sitting quietly in the back, suddenly stood up. He asked permission to speak. The judge allowed it. He cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, I was there when his wife wrote that letter. I can confirm its authenticity. She told me herself that she feared her son's future wife might one day try to take advantage of this property. She wanted her husband protected." Gasps filled the room. My daughter-in-law's face went pale. My son's hands shook as he covered his face. The judge finally spoke. "We will continue this case, but this new evidence carries great weight. Until further notice, the house will remain under the father's sole ownership." I felt a wave of relief, but I knew the war was not over. As I left the courthouse, I glanced back at my son. He looked torn apart, his loyalty divided, his heart heavy. And in that moment, I realized something painful. The fight was no longer just about property. It was about whether my son would choose love or greed.
Weeks passed and the case dragged on. Each hearing was like a battlefield. My daughter-in-law came prepared every time. Her lawyer armed with new arguments and manipulations. She tried everything, claiming I was too old to live alone, suggesting I had hidden wealth, even accusing me of mistreating her. Lies piled up one after another, and each time I sat there silently, letting my lawyer fight for me. But what cut me deepest was watching my son. He sat beside her, silent, almost like a prisoner in his own marriage. Sometimes his eyes would meet mine, filled with regret, but then he would quickly look away, afraid of her disapproval. One day after a hearing, I walked out of the courthouse and saw him standing alone by the parking lot. His shoulders were hunched, and he looked exhausted. I approached him slowly. "Son," I said gently, "is this really what you want? Look me in the eyes and tell me this is your fight." He hesitated. His lips trembled, and for a moment I thought he would finally break free from her grip. But then she appeared, marching toward us with fiery eyes. She grabbed his arm and hissed, "Don't listen to him, he's manipulating you." I stepped back, heart heavy, realizing my son was no longer free. He was trapped in her web, and the more I tried to pull him out, the tighter she held on. The next week, something shocking happened. Their lawyer presented a witness, a man who claimed he had overheard me saying I would give the house to my son. I had never seen this man before in my life. He was lying, and everyone knew it. But lies in court can still cause damage. My lawyer demanded to cross-examine him, and slowly the truth unraveled. The man stuttered, changed his words, and finally admitted he had been paid to testify. The courtroom erupted. The judge's face turned red with anger as he slammed his gavel. "If this court hears one more false testimony, there will be severe consequences." I looked straight at my daughter-in-law. Her face was pale. Her plan backfired. For the first time, even my son looked at her with doubt. A small crack had appeared in their unity. That night, I sat at home, staring at the family photo on the wall. My son as a little boy, smiling with ice cream smeared on his face. My wife standing beside me, her hand resting proudly on my shoulder. We had been a happy family once. Where had it all gone wrong? The phone rang. When I answered, it was my lawyer. He said, "We have a strong case, but be prepared. Your daughter-in-law is desperate. Desperate people do desperate things." He was right. The very next morning, I woke up to find graffiti sprayed across my front wall. "Selfish old man." My neighbors whispered, some shook their heads, others pretended not to notice. Shame burned inside me, but I refused to bow down. I painted over it myself, each brushstroke a declaration of strength. Later that evening, as I locked the front gate, I saw my son standing across the street. He wasn't with her this time. He looked lost, broken. He took a step toward me, then stopped. "Dad, I don't know what to do anymore." I wanted to run to him, to hold him, to tell him everything would be all right. But before I could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, saw her name, and his face hardened again. Without another word, he turned and walked away. And that was the night I realized the court battle was no longer just about property. It was a fight for my son's soul.
The final hearing arrived on a stormy morning. Dark clouds hung low in the sky, as if nature itself knew the weight of what was about to happen. I walked into the courthouse with steady steps, my heart heavy but unshaken. Inside, the air was tense. The courtroom was filled with curious onlookers, relatives, and even neighbors who had heard about the scandal. My son and daughter-in-law were already seated. She wore a sharp black suit, her chin lifted high, but I could see the cracks in her mask. He sat beside her, nervous. His eyes darted toward me and then away. The judge entered, and silence fell. Their lawyer spoke first, repeating the same arguments I had heard a dozen times, that I was too old, that my son deserved the house, that I had promised it. But his voice lacked the same strength as before. The lies had grown weaker, and even the judge's face showed impatience. Then my lawyer stood. His words were calm, but each sentence struck like thunder. "Your Honor, this case is not about law anymore. It is about greed. The father before you worked his entire life to build that home. He raised his son there, buried his wife from there, and protected it for decades. Now, because of the manipulation of a new family member, he stands accused of being selfish for holding on to what is rightfully his. Is this the kind of justice we want to see in this court?" The judge leaned forward, his gaze sharp. And then my lawyer pulled out the final piece of evidence, a video recording taken at the wedding reception by one of the guests. It showed the exact moment my daughter-in-law slapped me across the face and demanded the house. Gasps filled the courtroom as the footage played. Her arrogance, her disrespect, her cruelty, it was all there, undeniable. The judge banged his gavel. "Enough! I have seen and heard everything I need." He turned to my son. "Young man, you are fortunate to have a father who worked so hard for you. Instead of honoring him, you have allowed greed to blind you. Shame on you." My son's face turned red. He lowered his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. Finally, the judge gave his ruling. "The house remains solely in the father's name. This case is dismissed, and let this be a warning. This court will not tolerate false claims or fabricated evidence." The room erupted. Some clapped, others whispered, but all eyes turned to me. I did not smile, I did not gloat. I simply closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer to my late wife. We won. As people left the courtroom, my daughter-in-law stormed out in rage, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. But my son stayed behind. He walked toward me, his eyes swollen from crying. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry. I let her control me. I betrayed you. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at him for a long moment. My heart ached. He was my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the child I had once sung to sleep. Betrayal cut deep, but blood is blood. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "I forgive you, son, But forgiveness doesn't erase the choices you made. You'll have to rebuild my trust, brick by brick, just as I once built our home." He nodded, tears streaming freely now. That evening, I returned to my house. The setting sun cast a warm golden glow on its walls, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel empty. I stood in the doorway, remembering my wife's laughter, my children's footsteps, the countless dinners, the joys and sorrows we had shared. This house was not just mine. It was my legacy, and I had protected it, not only for myself, but for the generations yet to come. As I closed the door behind me, I whispered softly, "Some battles are fought not with fists, but with courage." And today I stood my ground. And in that quiet moment, I knew the war was over.